Today I'm going to talk about The Dom House. This is a book that I saw recommended on quite a number of booktubers' channels as it's recently been republished again as a vintage copy. Reading the blurb, the book was right up my street. It's about the nature of language, whether it's innate or the result of the environment, and it begs the question that without speech do we have the ability to think about ourselves and the nature of our existence. As a psychologist, I have read a number of non-fiction books about children who have been found in the wild, who do not possess language, and despite intensive interactions never go on to gain language. A particularly famous case was a child called Jeannie, who at 13 had been locked away in a back room in her parents' home in America until her mother took her to a hospital. The 1970s was a time when psychology was really grappling with the idea of nature versus nurture, how much of us is genetic, what we're born with, and how much of us is a result of the environment that we're in. Psychology has moved on greatly since the 1960s and 70s, and there's now a much better understanding that genes and environment interact with each other, and this is called epigenetics. So, this was a novel that was in an area of interest to me, and the narrator early on in the novel points out the problems with the wild child case studies and the case studies of Jeannie, suggesting that he has read around this literature himself, and namely the main problem is we don't know with any of these children is whether they would have spoken if they'd been brought up in a normal environment, or whether the whole reason they were abandoned or shut away was because they were not developing normally and therefore would never have developed language anyway. So the narrator picks up on this big flaw. Obviously you can't in real life carry out an experiment such as this, i.e. take one child and put them in isolation and another child and bring them up normally to see the impact of environment on language development, or whether children will develop language even if they don't have exposure to it. So novels that explore the forbidden experiment, as it's called, are intriguing, and this is one of them. So the premise of the novel is that the narrator has an obsession, first of all, with finding out where the soul resides in the body. The narrator lives with a rather overbearing mother who he's very, very close to, and a distant but rich father who buys him lots of gifts to try and buy his affection. One of those gifts is a dissecting kit that he then uses to dissect animals looking for the soul. And he moves to a point where he dissects live animals and looks at the moment of death to see if he can discover the soul. So as we can see, we've got a very familiar childhood trope where we're setting up a psychopath of the future, someone who is likely to progress from animals to people. So there was nothing particularly new about that information. However, I was intrigued to find out how he would carry out his experiment. When his mother dies, he goes into a period of grief and he begins thinking about the stories that his mother told him when he was a child. One of the stories that he remembers vividly is the Dom House. Whether it's real or a myth is unclear, likely partly real, partly myth, where a group of children are put into a house where they are brought up in silence, so the adults around them do not speak to them. The idea being that we should then discover the language of God. However, these children never did speak, hence the name The Dom House. The narrator decides to run his own experiment on language after fortuitously coming across a girl that lives on the streets. He kills her boyfriend and takes her in, and he takes her in order to impregnate her. There's a lot right with this novel. I mean, it's very well written, the character is compelling, fascinating, dark. The story is a horror and it does build to a shocking climax. However, for me personally, it wasn't something I will certainly rave about. It was one of those novels that starts at the end and then spends the rest of the time going back to the beginning. I found this annoying, and I often find this annoying in novels because I wanted to move beyond the starting point, and I was hoping all the way through that we'd go further than the starting point of the novel, that we'd move into more interesting territory in terms of the experiments. And the experiment the narrator set up himself was as flawed as the ones that he'd critiqued earlier. So his argument was that if you put a child in isolation and they don't learn to speak, how do you know if that child would have learned to speak anyway, or whether there was something wrong with that child? I got kind of excited by the premise when the street girl gives birth to twins, and I'm thinking, now what he's going to do is, well, my assumption was that he'll take one twin and isolate it, and the other twin he'll bring up normally, and therefore you have a natural control group. However, this is not what he does, and you would need identical twins for that as well. So you'd need genetic clones of each other, one you isolate, one you bring up normally, and therefore you'd be able to ascertain whether language only develops when you're exposed to language, or whether language will develop independently of exposure. However, he didn't do that. His twins were a boy and a girl, so in fact they were non-identical twins, so you couldn't have carried out the experiment. And he isolates both of them together. And the reason he gives for this is that he assumes that a child will only use language if there's someone to communicate with. So therefore he puts two children together, then he might see natural language occurring. This doesn't happen. The twins do not speak to each other, and what they do start doing is they start singing, and they start singing to each other. And this is the bit that got me really interested, because one thing that we do know about language development across the world is that every culture uses rhymes and sort of nursery type rhymes to young children, regardless of the language that they speak, which suggests that rhyme, particularly rhyming, and musical notes are something that are quite universal in terms of developing language. So I then thought the novel was going to go down an interesting route to find that actually, or to propose that actually innate language is musical. However, Luke, the narrator, decides that the singing has no discernible communicative intent, and he decides that it's purely there as a comfort for each child, just to let the child know that they're there. And because of that, he gets annoyed by the singing, and he then removes the larynx, or the voice box of one of the children. Again, I'm really not sure why he did that. The reason given in the novel is because then he wants to see if they'll have to try and communicate in a different way. But if he was really interested in language and speech production and hearing innate language, then removing the larynx of one twin was not going to help him to achieve his aim. He then, literally a few days later, removes the larynx of the other child. And before he's even given those children time to develop a new way of speaking, maybe some form of sign language, he then decides the experiment has failed and he wants to get rid of them. Now the reason for that in the book is because the twins unnerve him, make him feel uncomfortable, and it reminds him of a cat that his father had bought him that also made him feel uncomfortable because it was pathetic, and he feels that the twins are pathetic and not really living real lives. But that's where the novel lost. That's where the novel lost me. I think the problem partly for me is I know too much about language development already, and I've read too many books, particularly non-fiction books around real life cases, and therefore I guess I wanted this novel to go further than what I'd read before, to take speculative leaps into what might happen if we did carry out a controlled experiment today. Obviously we couldn't, because you can't do that to children. It would be highly unethical for a psychologist to do that. However, if you don't know much about the debate around language and whether we can even think without language, or whether we can be considered human when we don't have language, then I think you'll find this novel interesting because it introduces those ideas and gets you thinking in that way. The plot is dark, and as I said before, it's a racy read. It's not a hugely long read. It's similar in tone to novels like Perfume and The Wasp Factory. I certainly don't regret reading it. I just don't really think it lives up to the hype that I read. But then all that tells me is that as readers we come to books with very different experiences, very different ways of understanding the world. And for me personally, this novel didn't stretch my imagination or make me think differently about the subject. But that doesn't mean to say it won't for you. See you again soon.